Hello, all. It sounds so weird because I hear my voice here and then up there. It's like, oh, I'm coming down from the heavens. Oh, look, slides up there. My name is Joe Guadagno. I am a senior director at Rocket Mortgage. Wow, that's really troubling, the echo. Also in the .NET Foundation on the board of directors, I am a vice chairman. But enough about that. Here's some contact information if you want. I should probably stay in the light so they can see me in the other rooms. Reach out to me here and anything. I blog a lot, post a lot, and tweet a lot on the bottom examples. In the GitHub repo that's listed below, you'll see a copy of one of the decks that we're going to be using. Before we get started, question for you. How many of you is your first Star Trek? Oh, quite a bit. How many of you love when the instructor or presenter makes you raise your hand? Yeah, not too many. How many people are in the other simulcast rooms raising your hand, assuming I can see you? I used that one last time. It's one of my favorites. This also one of the conferences that's really hard to use one of my developer jokes that I use. Only because when I talk about when you start showing up in events, a lot of people, well, before COVID, would intentionally follow the men's urinal style of seating. Person, empty seat, person, empty seat, person, empty seat. It's a little bit hard to hear because you got some of that built-in padding and there's not a lot of chairs here. Anyway, enough of that. Let's talk about the agenda. We're going to talk about how you can get started. Can we cut down that delay a little bit? I don't know about you, but I hear it twice. We're going to talk about what a developer container is, and then we're going to go into how you can build a container, and then customize them, and then how you go about using those in Visual Studio Code, as well as we're going to show you how you use them in GitHub, which is kind of handy. And then we're going to work on multiple containers inside of one dev container, and then again, opening it in GitHub. So why do we want that? Basically because, you get people to say it works on my machine, one more, fill in the blank. And we're going to kind of show you how you can go away from saying it works on my machine. Now, one caveat, it doesn't work on every machine, and it doesn't work in any developer scenario. If you have something that needs a lot of user interface or you can't do with just Visual Studio Code, this won't really work for you because it doesn't support like UIs and things like that. So, some of the requirements. You're going to need Docker desktop. You can do it with Rancher, but you basically need the Docker command line because you're going to spin up containers behind the scene. If you're on Linux, you need Docker CE or Docker EE. Basically, anything you can run Visual Studio Code on, you can use this for. You need Visual Studio Code, although now you can actually do it from JetBrains Writer also. And Visual Studio doesn't work yet, so eventually they'll get to it. And then you need the dev containers extension. If you played around with this in the earlier days, it was called the remote containers experience. And actually, if you look at the extension in Visual Studio, the code name is remote containers instead of dev containers. So let's build some containers. Before we go and do that, let's talk about what a dev container is. So if you look, let's get my laser pointer up. You see here, we have the dev container section and then production container. And what's different about dev containers is they contain a lot more than your typical production container. You have your source code, your personalization, debuggers, and then the compilers, and ultimately the OS. So you see here in development, let's say, or locally, you can actually install and run a lot of these things locally in your dev box. Like I can sit here and install Visual Studio, .NET, SQL Server, all the things I'm going to do to run the next couple of apps. But with a dev container, it allows you to put it in one isolated box, a container, so to speak. And then the beauty of it is you can shift the one configuration file, and then anyone can use it across the board, which we'll see. So the one thing we all share in common is the operating system's runtime and the shared library. That's what we need, and that's what really the container is. What comes in different when we're in development is working with the compilers, SDKs, and so on. Like I can send in an entire container to production, but I don't necessarily need the compiler, the SDK, MS Build, or NPM, that kind of stuff. But when I'm working locally, I want to have the debugger and everything. So that's where dev container comes in really helpful. One of the big use cases for this is, and we'll talk about the example a little bit more, but in my work environment, we use Jekyll to generate documentation for one of our projects. And if you've ever used Jekyll, it's pretty handy, pretty easy to use, but the setup is a pain. You have to install Rubies, which if you're on a Windows PC is a little challenging. Then you have to install Jekyll, then you have to install Bundler. You have to install a lot of things, and there's a lot of configuration. Using dev containers, it's one file. Download it, we can run it. As long as we have Docker, we can build our stuff in no time. So let's look what makes up a developer container. So the container itself contains all this. Containers are built on a template. A template, which we'll show some examples of, is basically the operating system and a series of libraries or SDK. So if you're running, let's say, .NET 7, you'll have a Windows or Linux operating system, and then the .NET SDK. Then on top of that, we add features. The features are the compilers and the build tools. So in the case of .NET, it has MS Build, the linking libraries, and everything else. Then the container itself has everything that we need as developers. Our productivity tools, any extensions we need, like you'll see when we go and build a Microsoft SQL Server container, it has MS Tools built in and a couple other things. And then whatever debuggers and personalization you want, like colors, themes, etc. So some of the examples of templates, we have an Alpine, Debian, C#, etc. We're going to see more of them in a minute. And this list is very small compared to what's actually there. And because it's still relatively new, they're adding in new ones daily. Same thing with features. Features, there are a lot of different features available to add. Now these are add-ons. If you think about it like you have a brand new laptop, just installed, has the operating system. Now when you get in there, you typically want to install something like Winget or Scoop or Chocolatey, and then go through and add on stuff. That's what kind of features are. It allows you to choose what tools you want to be inside your VM. We're going to choose two just because it's relatively easy, but you can add PowerShell, .NET, AWS, Azure, whichever ones you want. So let's go through and see some of that. Let's stop the PowerPoint. It's like I hear voices in my head with the echo. Okay, let's go. Actually, before we do that, let's go to the web and take a look at the features. So hopefully in the back row you can see this well enough. At least one thumb. Okay, thank you. So actually, let's do the templates. Let's do the templates. So you can see you can come here and go through and find just about anything. Alpine, C++, Debian, You can use existing Docker containers, C#, C# with MS SQL, etc. Basically any combo you can think of. Now you notice these are all hyperlinks, because if you go and click on one of them, it'll take you to the actual settings. So behind the scenes, and bear with the slowness, it's hot-spotted through my phone. Behind the scenes, it's actually building a Docker YAML file for you that gets compiled, which we'll see when we do the C# feature. While that's loading, let's go to the features. So like I said, the features are a bunch of add-ins. Now there's two different maintainers that you'll see here. Basically, the dev container spec maintainers. So that's the group at Microsoft that supports the dev containers project, and they add in some of the stuff. And then if you scroll down, you'll eventually come to others. So this is supported by a company called Iterative, Rocket Project, and so on. So there's a little hesitation with some people to put those in because there's a trust factor. Basically, this page is built based on PRs. So you can contribute a project to it. There's some research that goes into it. Once it's approved, it then makes this site and available for you to use. But you can see there's basically everything you need from a software standpoint. And more get added every day. Like I could check this list tomorrow and I guarantee there'll be almost one or two new things added. So let's go and see how we create a basic one. So here I have an instance of Visual Studio Code with nothing in here. It's an empty folder. If I open up this folder in Explorer, which should be here. Actually, I got right here, so if I can do a list, if I can do a list, hello. If I could, you would see that there's nothing there. So how do we get started? So I did Control-Shift-P or Command-Shift-P if you're on the Mac to bring up the command palette. Now if you do dev containers, you'll see that there is a list of items to do. Rebuild, reopen, add, open, etc. The first thing we want to do is add a dev configuration file. Now this takes a second because it's going out to the internet, coming back with a list. And if it doesn't come back quick enough, I have a video to show it. And let's go to the videotape. Try it one more time. See if it's loading. Yeah, as we can see, it didn't go through. Let me just make sure I'm connected. Reconnecting one more time. And if this doesn't work, the other one I have preloaded. Nope, it failed. Okay. Give me 1 second, I'll pull up the video. Ooh, the legacy. Oh, look, there it comes. So here's the list of dev containers, which should map that file that we showed before. So if I type C#.NET containers, Click that, and then it's going to give you a bunch of options. These options are template specific. So because this is the .NET template, it wants to know what version of .NET I'm running. So you see here it lists 7.0 as the default. There's also 6.0, and then there's a couple of weird ones like Bullseye and Jammy and Focal. Those are all specific containers for a specific environment. So if I choose the default, it's going to choose the best one for this. But if I want to do something that only works on, let's say, the Mac M1 chips, I would choose the Bullseye one, and then it ensures that all the binaries work with that. Not every one of these containers has a configuration, but the ones we're going to deal with do. So I'm going to choose the default, and then I have the option to add in some features. So I'm going to go with the first feature of common utilities. This has things like OMySCS, some PowerShell tools, and a bunch of other stuff that I use regularly. And then there's some ZSH plugins. And then the last one I'm going to do was, simple one I need, the GitHub CLI. And then click OK. And then have the options, because some of them have configuration where I can go through and specify some more things, like for SCH, do I want to run it as root, or do I want to run it as a particular user, or something like that. And what did I click? Oh, apparently I hit enter. One of the things that you didn't see, the ZSH plugins is what's called a community contrib project. That means that someone from the community, non-part of the dev containers team, built it. So there's a dialog box that comes up saying, hey, do you trust this source for it? Because I've run this demo once or twice before, I don't have that prompt. But if I pick a new feature that was from a contributor, I would get that. And it looked like it failed to load, probably because the connection. Yeah, so let's pull up the demo for it. Oh, come on. Is that small enough for everyone? So here's where I click Control P, and then going through and seeing some of the items. Eventually I click on the C#.NET containers, pick 7.0, which you saw, select the 3 plugins. It's like deja vu. Pretty sure we just did this. Click GitHub CLI. And then SCH. I don't know why I keep saying SCH. One day I'll get it right. Click OK. And I'm going to keep the defaults. And if there was a decent internet connection, out comes this file. Now look at that, the video ended. So I have a copy of that file. So let's just go through the recycle bin and restore it. So if we pretended the internet connection worked, I would get a file like this. Now this file contains a couple of things. It looks similar to a YAML file because it has a lot of consistencies with it. The first thing you see here on line 4 is the name of it. The name doesn't really mean anything. You'll see the name just here and really nowhere else. This is the image that we're using. In this case, we're using the mcrmicrosoft.com devcontainers.net 0 dash. And then this looks familiar because this was the default we chose, 7.0. So if we chose 6.0, this would say 6.0, etc. And these are the 3 features that were added. So you're probably thinking to yourself, well, I can kind of create this dev container by myself. And the answer is yes, you can. If you go through the pages here, you can notice that this is the common utilities. If I look back at the GitHub spec, it's exactly the same name. So I can see what I want and just add it here. The Visual Studio just provides a helpful UI for it. And there's a couple other things that we're not using in this image, but we'll use in other images. And that's features, forwarding ports, post create, customization, and then this is if you're having trouble or you need certain security permissions, you can override the default user. So I'm going to go and build this now. So I'm going to click rebuild and reopen in container. Now if we go and look, we get this little dialog box down here that says opening command. And then we get a runtime error. So let's go and look at starting. Oh man, I had this happen yesterday. There's actually an update that was applied that broke this. So let's go back to the videotape and look at the next part. Apparently I was listening to music because I can hear the music in the background. Let me mute my speaker. Apparently I recorded the music while I was doing it too. So here we're seeing down below the scripts that are running. If we look, it's running a bunch of Docker commands. And it spits out a library ultimately, or a container ultimately, that if we look, I'm going to let it finish. Because once it builds, you're going to get a little dialog box that pops up right around here. 3. Come on. There it goes. It's that last sent. What's happening is it's starting to load the extensions, and you have to wait for all the extensions to be fully loaded. Let's see if this worked. Again, nope. Oh, you know what it is? I know what this is. We'll come back to it. Oh, there it goes. So I pulled in an old version. This actually, shut up. This actually got updated to 1, I believe. One of the things also that Visual Studio will realize is once you change the container, it'll prompt for a rebuild. Let's see, make sure I got the right container name. C#. Oh, I lost the connection again. funny, when I first started the talk, I had a full 5 bars of data, and now because I'm on stage, it's 1 bar. Okay, let's go to one that is actually built. So I'm going to take a look at Docker for a second. And you notice I have some very weird names here. Strange Leaderberg, Gallant, Chad Roskikar, and then semi-normal container demo, MS container. So what ends up happening is when these containers are built, they're built with 2 random names that come up. So every time you do a rebuild container or a build container, Visual Studio and the toolkit will pick 2 random nouns and put them together, which is kind of rough because you can't figure out what you have. Like this one here, because it's Jekyll 1, I know it's for my website, and my website is now Strange Leaderberg. This is the container for SQL. Now the reason why this has a semi-normal name is because it's actually 2 containers in one. I don't understand the logic or reasoning behind it, but that is how it works. So let's take a look at what this dev container looks like. So this one is slightly different because there's a Docker compose file. Now the Docker compose file is built based on the compose file that the template has. But there's a couple of more added features. Here is a service, which if you've done Docker compose before, this maps to a service. So we're going to create a service ultimately called app, which is our C# code. And then we have a workspace folder, which is going to map to a path here. Basically, whatever folder we have, which in this case is container demo MySQL or MS SQL. Then we have customizations. The customizations allows you to customize Visual Studio Code. So here I am saying that I want you to add settings to this instance of Visual Studio Code, because you're going to actually run Visual Studio Code inside the container. And you're going to have a setting called mssql.connections, which has a whole bunch of info. Then, and I'll get back to those settings, we're going to add 2 extensions, the MS.NET DevTools C# and the MS SQL extension. So what this provides is over here, I'll get an extension to connect to SQL Server inside of this unit. And this is just the connection info. Now you're probably thinking, why do I have the user ID and password in this file? Ultimately, this file is going to be checked into SourceSafe or ADS or GitHub. This is the password for the local container instance of SQL Server. Now, I can do something like environment and pull it from an environment variable, but out of the box, when you do file new or Control-Shift-P, it's going to generate this generic one. So the choices are yours. For this demo, it doesn't matter because this is just working inside the container. And you'll see that by default, none of the ports are open, so I won't have access to the SQL Server that's running here. You'll also notice that there's this new post create command. Now what the post create does is after your container is built and up and running, it runs this command. And it only does it once it's created. So for the sample container that comes out for the MS MySQL or MS SQL Server, it runs a post commit command to basically create a sample database. In yours, you probably wouldn't do this, but you would run whatever scripts to build your sample database that you want. And then there's a bunch of samples here. So let's try to rebuild this one and reopen. In the meantime, I'm going to check the internet connection. Let's see if I just sit here and do a demo like this. This one failed again. The good thing is I probably don't have to rebuild it because it already exists. So I'm going to do attach to running container. And there are no containers because I didn't start it. So let's start this container. Now let's go through. Now I should be able to attach. Dev containers attached to running. And then ultimately, it should open up and I would have access to it. And apparently, in order to run these, you need internet connection for everything. Let's see if I have video for that one. Actually, I don't. I have video for the next slide because this one was supposed to work without a connection. So let's go to the next lovely part. Let's hopefully this one doesn't crash and burn too. Although this one does require internet. So one of the huge benefits, I can try. I'm using mine, and mine has 1 bar.
Should say Niranjan's iPhone. This one right here.
This one?
Yeah. This is the best one.
Don't walk away. No. Yeah, I know. I get it. Thank you. Okay, we got internet connection. Let's see if it works. And then we could put an end to the old Android versus iPhone debate if it works. Let's see. Let's grab the right one. This one. Let's put you back to 0. Control-Shift-P. Rebuild and reopen. It's going. Damn it, stupid iPhones. Who knew that T-Mobile wouldn't work well inside of concrete walls? But it could be just the location of it. Yeah, this is actually going, because you can see here now it downloaded it. It's downloading the Visual Studio Code server, so it's getting the code. So I'll let that one run, and then we can come back to it. In the meantime, so here is the Git repo for my website, josephguadagno.net. So I'm going to just zoom in a little bit. So here I have an existing dev container. Once I look at it, you'll see it looks pretty similar to the others, except this one's using a Jekyll, Bullseye. And then I added a couple of extensions I wanted to use. So let's say I was at work on my work PC or, at a friend's house and I had this inspiration and wanted to write a blog post. But I didn't have my laptop and, just had my brother-in-law's laptop, which is 300 years old, and I want to do something. So I can actually come here to GitHub, and under code, I can do create code space on main. Once I do that, behind the scenes, GitHub is building a container for me and putting a copy of Visual Studio Code in it. As we can see right here, it's setting up the remote connection, building a code space. As it's doing that, we can kind of look here. Actually, we can't. It's building it, connecting to it, and putting all the files on it. Now, normally the first time you do this, it takes a minute to 10 minutes. If you're doing it for your site or something like this where you plan on using dev containers, you can do what's called a pre-build, and it will download everything to the GitHub virtual servers and kind of pre-compile your website so it only does like the net new, which is why this one ran so fast. So if we look at it, this is a copy of Visual Studio Code that's running the source for my site. So if I look here, I have a folder called Data Includes, Layout, Pages, etc. That is all right here now. So let's say I want to go and update the presentation page for this. Where are we? Dev containers. I'm going to add a new line in here saying, make sure you have working internet or an iPhone with working internet. So I'm going to save this, and then I'm going to go here, and because this is using Jekyll, I want to make sure I have the latest, which I think I just need to do that. And now I'm going to run a bundle, execute Jekyll serve, and in about a minute, give or take, it'll compile the website and be available. That's what this generating feed is. You'll notice right here, which we didn't get to see on the SQL Server one, there's a number here now. Because inside of our configuration, I added that I want to expose port 4000. Now we see here, it says, hey, your application is running, just open up port 4000. Do you want to open it? And it's going to open that. But we can see right here that the site built and said now it's running at localhost 4000. Now, obviously, it's not running on localhost. This is running in the cloud on the virtual machine, which we can see right here. Now, remember how I said it generates a random name? So on the GitHub, when you run it, the first part, that's my GitHub username, Guadagno. Then there's Reimagine Train is the name of the container. This happens to be the server name that I'm running on. And then the dash 4000 is to emulate port 4000. And then the rest is on preview.app.github. Now, if we zoom out, we have this first blog post of getting started. Now, if I go and look at it, there is nothing in there. Did I not save it, or did I open up the wrong post? No, I did. Oh, you know what I have to do? Apparently save it. But sometimes the code spaces get a little bit weary and you have to kind of do a git pull or re-update it. But this should show up. 18 seconds. Oh, that was the blog post. I didn't update the blog post. I updated the actual talk. So we go to dev connections. Here it is. Make sure you have a working copy, blah, blah, blah. So this allows me to edit my page from anywhere. I didn't update anything locally. If I was to save this, which I'm not, I can then do a git pull, bring it down to my local machine, and see it. So that's kind of a really neat feature. The code spaces is a paid service through GitHub, but you get a certain number of compute hours for free. Now, if I check the settings of this repo, I can go down to code spaces and see I have a pre-built configuration, and I can actually look at it, stop it, or start it, or rebuild it. So I did a pre-build prior to this, knowing that I had an Android on T-Mobile that sucks. But it's also helps for faster builds, and the pre-builds don't really cost you anything. But if I look at the repo now, under code spaces, you see I have the reimagined train, and there are uncommitted changes to the branch because I modified that one file. GitHub says I have something to add. And I could, from here, I can delete it, I can change the machine type if it's not powerful enough, or just simply remove it. I can also open it in a browser, which is what we did on the other tab, or I can open it in Visual Studio Code directly. So this will pull down a copy in Visual Studio Code and allow me to connect to the virtual machine that's running there. It won't run in a Docker container locally unless I pull it down and use the dev containers. Or I can open in JetBrains Gateway or Jupyter Lab. So that's kind of cool. Let's go back and see if this other container is built. And everything is done. And I think I'm in the container here. As we can see right here, it says dev container C#.net. So now I'm in here and I can do anything I want to that I would be able to do with .NET on my machine. So I'm going to go and open up a terminal. Now this terminal is inside the container. Although the container has a workspace path or a volume that looks at my local machine, basically C project / container demo. So if I was to go and do a .NET or .NET new console name hello dev containers, in a couple of seconds, you see it's creating a project in container demos, hello containers project, and I can do a .NET run, and it couldn't find a container because I have to cd hello containers, then do a .NET run. And in a couple of seconds, I should get the proverbial hello world. So I made my 2023 speaker credentials in one talk by having a demo, fail, and hello world. So I got my current speaker credentials. I got to make sure I log that on the MVP site. So I'm going to add a couple other things just to do, show that you have full control over it. I could have wrote something a lot worse with this demo, but you don't know who's watching it. So if I put a breakpoint here, let's save it, then come back down and do a .NET run, I should still get the breakpoint, although I did run, not debug. So let's come here and choose run and debug. And then after all the assets are done, it should run. I think it's still going. Let's do that. That might take a second because it has to download everything. Let's go and see if this SQL Server one is running yet. It wasn't that one. This one, Control-Shift-P, rebuild container. While that is going, I must have a much better connection up there than I had over here. That's what it's supposed to look like. You see, if we start looking at this one, you can see it generated a Docker Compose file that has an app with build instructions, and it's ready. So now I have a SQL Server database. Give it a second. You see right here, I have the little clock. That means it's loading extensions right now. So it's going through and downloading the 2 extensions I have, or that I requested for it. There it goes. So now they're downloaded. You see here, I have 2 extensions. So I click here, which is a SQL Server browser. It's going to go through and install the tools, and then I'll see a connection called, I think it says application database. Oh, the iPhone failed me this time. But it would have the connection here that would allow me to connect to the database. And I can, because I have the DB tools, I can create a database connection. Now it doesn't have database type. Well, assuming we had a perfect internet connection, we would actually see the tools download, but the tools are something like 100 meg, so might be a little bit much on a 5G connection. So let's go back to the slides for a minute. So these are the settings that you can do. There are a couple of more, but these are the most common. You'll find yourself using features, forwarding ports, and customizations almost every time. And then the post create and the post start kind of vary. For my Jekyll site, I could have set the post start to run that bundle, execute, Jekyll, serve. But I didn't want to do that because I don't want the server to start every time because I'm usually going there and making changes anyway, which will cause it to stop and then restart. So remember, assuming you have a working internet connection, it works on my machine now. Now it's a DevOps problem to figure out, or an internet problem. So open up, we got about 10 minutes left to any questions. Meantime, here are some URLs that you can get to. I have a blog post that covers a lot of what I did on the site above with container posts. You can get to the Git repo that showed my working website with a working example and everything else. All these slides are also available on my site there. Contact information is coming up there. So do I have any questions on Discord or in the room? If you do have it, you have to like really raise your hands because these lights are super bright. I see way in the back row. Do we have microphones or? Okay, so talk loudly and I'll repeat it. The guy or lady, you, yeah. How do they work? Normally you bring up a container and you don't get an interface. So behind the scenes, what ends up happening is a Docker container is being built, one or more, depending on what you're doing. So as we see, where are we? This determined Jackson one was being built by Visual Studio Code. So behind the scenes, it created a Docker Compose file that executed. It then created what's called a Visual Studio Code server that's running in that container that provides the instance. So have you ever heard of Live Share? It runs Live Share behind the scenes, which basically opens up a listener in the container that's running. Visual Studio interacts with that container and kind of communicates. So sort of like SignalR, it allows a connection there, and Visual Studio Code will kind of pretend it's the UI inside that container.
We got a question from Discord. Are there any costs associated with the demo today?
Are there any costs with the things demoed today? The short answer is no. The long answer is it really depends. So everything I showed except for the code spaces was free. As long as you have Visual Studio Code, which is free, Docker, which is free, Visual Studio works, or Visual Studio and .NET work for free. The SQL Server instance running locally is free. The code spaces working on GitHub is semi-free. You get something like 100 or 200 compute hours a month for free. But outside of that, mostly everything else is free. Any others? Yes?
So what's the benefit of using dev containers versus just building your own Docker Compose file? Is it just easier to build that way?
It's easier. So the question was, what's the benefit of using dev containers versus just building your own Docker Compose files? The ease is in the add-ons. So being able to kind of pick and choose what pieces and not have to worry about the Docker Compose or the one space versus two spaces in the YAML file. But most of it is assembling a pre-built container based on the pieces you want and not having to do it. Behind the scenes, it generates the full YAML for you. And if you look back at our SQL example, it actually has a Docker file and a Docker compose file. It just adds in other stuff on top of it. It's really meant for us as developers to not have to worry about what the Docker compose file looks like. Any others? By the way, these four said they were going to be heckling me the whole time and or making comments, and they haven't said a peep. Yes.
If you're working on a team, what would you need to share between people, or would it just be once it's built, you could like push to GitHub and then pull down a Git repo with everything already?
So the question is, once you're on a team, what do you need to share? Do you have to send it to GitHub, build it, and then take it back down? The only thing you really need to share is the dev container folder, so which should be in your Git repo. So if we look at my example here, anyone who pulls down this site, and this is a public repo, so you can literally pull down my website or my blog and run it on your machine because I have this .dev container which has the instructions to build and execute this site. There's also, for this particular site, a run in Docker and a Docker file, but that was before I discovered this. So as long as you have this file, anyone on your team can do it. They may have to build it once to run it locally, and you'll have to do that no matter what because the actual containers aren't saved anywhere but locally. In the github.com example, they're basically running Docker on their end and magically connecting you to it. Any others? Cool. I'm done. If there's someone sleeping next to you, just nudge him or her to wake them up to go for the next talk, unless they're planning on continuing their nap in the next section. Great day. Any questions? Feel free to reach out here. Sorry about the internet connections, and thank you, gentlemen, for allowing me to use your connection.